Welcome to Illuminated, a television show that discusses solutions to real-world issues. I'm Joseph Michael Carr, the state chair of the Independent Voters of Illinois Independent Precinct Organization, better known as IVI-IPO. Tonight, I'm co-hosting with our friend and member, Jim Garfield. I'm going to turn it over to Jim to meet our first guest. Jim?
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us today. So, as noted, my name is Jim Garfield. I'm the Public Relations Chair for IVI-IPO, and I'm so delighted you could join us today. So, let's jump into this. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I know, sounds weird, but that's where we're starting, because it says that the most basic things we need are food, water, and shelter. The thing we're talking about today is shelter. We're talking about housing. Now, our guest for that is Clint Sabin. Clint's been a policy analyst for the Illinois legislature. He's also been a senior leadership on the Regional Transportation Authority, and for the past 10 years has been a public affairs consultant, most recently doing work with the Nboa, the Neighborhood Building Owners Alliance. So thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So the Nboa, what is it?
It's a great question. Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about housing today on your program. The Nboa, the Neighborhood Building Owners Alliance, is an alliance of Chicago-based community organizations and housing providers that provide housing in Chicago's neighborhoods. Most people do not realize that the bulk of housing in Chicago that's rental housing is provided by somebody who owns less than 20 units. So these people are not large corporations. They do not have access to large amounts of capital. They are our fellow Chicagoans. They typically have day jobs, and being a housing provider is something they do on the nights and weekends.
Now, you said that most of them are regular individuals. They don't have big units. Does the Nboa also encompass kind of larger companies as well, or is it all small ownership?
So our membership is 8 affiliate organizations, and those affiliate organizations are based in Chicago's neighborhoods. And so those organizations then have individual members who own 2, 3, 4 flats, courtyard buildings, and things like that.
Okay. Now, I want to clarify, when we say housing provider, is that a fancy term for landlord? Are we still talking about the same thing there?
Right.
Okay.
Landlord gives people the impression that the owner of the property is royalty or has large amounts of capital, and that's really not the truth. The truth is most housing providers are our fellow Chicagoans. They buy locally, they hire locally, they sometimes even live in the same building as their residents, and so that's what a typical housing provider really is.
Now, I was looking at the associations that are involved in Nboa, and if I missed one, let me know. We have the Edgewater Uptown Builders Association, Greater Austin Development Association, Lakeview Developers Association, Lincoln Park Builders of Chicago, Northwest Side Builders Coalition, Rogers Park Builders Group, Southside Builders Association, Southside Community Investment Association. Did I miss one?
No, that sounds to be about right. But
Okay.
we also have a couple more that are in the middle of joining the organization and joining the coalition.
Okay, great. Now, to clarify, a lot of these have building and developer in the name. Are any of them actually like a construction company that's involved in developing building, or is it all owners?
No, it's all housing providers. So our members have relationships with developers, but our membership is mostly just housing providers.
Okay. Now, what kind of work does the Nboa do on their behalf?
So the Nboa helps our members understand what's going on in the housing industry and how to prepare for those changes. The past year, of course, has been very difficult for every industry imaginable. And I think the pandemic has shown the importance of housing. We were all told to stay home and save lives. And so housing became of utmost importance to fighting the pandemic. However, with so many people unable or unwilling to pay their rent, that created a real problem for housing providers whose expenses didn't go down. In fact, in most cases, they went up. And so for those individuals and small businesses struggling to make their payroll, to pay the water bill, pay their property taxes, stay current on their mortgage, the past year has been very difficult. And if you only have 4 or 5 units and one of them is unable or unwilling to pay rent, that adds up real fast.
That's being 20 to 25% of the total income from the rental property.
Correct.
Okay. We know that there's been some relief from the federal and state governments for renters, rental assistance. Has there been anything like that for the actual housing providers?
That's a great question, and rental assistance is definitely something that we're looking forward to. The state of Illinois just rolled out its program last week. The city of Chicago rolled out its program today, and those programs will do a lot to stabilize our housing industry, which has been destabilized because of the pandemic. It's important to note, though, that those programs will not solve all of the problems, right? The tenant has to be a part of the application process. And in many cases, tenants just don't understand the value of participating in those programs because the funds go directly to the housing provider. We'll also have tenants who have already moved on and we'll have difficulty getting a hold of them. And we also anticipate there'll be immigrants who are reluctant to share personal information with a government agency.
Understandable in many cases.
Right.
So.
Then we also have tenants who just won't qualify for the programs because they make too much money or anything like that. And so it's going to be a real problem. The total unpaid debt in Chicago for renters is $1 billion. So that's $1 billion that housing providers don't have to pay their bills. And the rental assistance funds, well, will help with that problem. The funds available is far short of the need.
So, and you said $1 billion, that's just the city of Chicago, that's not all of Illinois?
Correct.
Okay. And that's all just residential, we're not talking any commercial?
Correct.
Okay. Are the property owners, the housing providers, are they kind of instituting programs to say, hey, renters, hey, the people who actually live here, you need to sign up for this. Here's how you do it. Let's have a community meeting and walk you through it.
Right. So the Nboa is working with its affiliates and partnering with elected officials and community organizations to spread the word. And so that's one of the reasons I'm here today is talk about the rental assistance programs and encourage people to take the time and apply and seek those funds. And those funds can cancel a lot of your rent debt and also provide much needed crucial funding to the housing provider so they can continue to operate and maintain the building.
So is it essentially the renter applies for it, they say I'm behind by X amount, the state goes, yes you are, okay, and pays that amount to the provider?
It's important to realize that every program is different. The state of Illinois has a program, the city of Chicago has a program, Cook County has a program, all of the suburban counties all have programs. So it's difficult for me to speak with specificity. It's difficult for me to be specific with each program. However, they all work in generally the same way, which is either the housing provider applies to the program and the renter then verifies that information, or the opposite. The renter applies to the program and the housing provider verifies the information. The government agency will then ensure that the person is actually qualified to receive those funds, and assuming they are, will write a check directly to the housing provider.
Now, in terms of we'll go with the state of Illinois one, do you know, since county by county, we can't expect you to know all of those, do you know, is there a website that people can go to for the state one?
Yeah, the Illinois Housing Development Authority is offering their program. I should have brought the website. What can I say? The Illinois Housing Development Authority has their program. You can just Google Illinois Housing Development and it pops up very easily and it's easy to find.
Okay. I mean, the more we can help people find these programs, the better. So, now you mentioned that, of course, the pandemic has been an unprecedented toll on these housing providers. What do we see going forward in terms of renters catching up on paying their rent, on property owners and housing providers being able to keep people in there? How are we looking now that the pandemic is coming to an end, more or less?
Well, it's important to realize that a lot of this rent debt goes all the way back to 2019 for some people. And the likelihood that we'll be able to collect that debt is very small. Typically, when people owe their housing provider money, if they owe 1 month's rent or less, they're more than willing to pay typically. But if they owe more than that, it's very difficult for them to get caught up. So without the rental assistance programs, it's going to be very challenging for housing providers to get caught up and pay all their bills. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is a lot of housing providers in Chicago just can't make it work. It was already difficult to provide housing in Chicago because of its regulatory environment. And so after this past year, when so many people were unable or unwilling to pay rent, and there was no support going to these housing providers, and instead government agencies were creating more requirements and more regulations, it's just unsustainable for a lot of these smaller individuals to maintain. And so they're unfortunately being forced to sell their properties. And those buyers are typically not from Chicago. And so we don't really know what the face of Chicago's housing is going to look like in the future. It's also worth noting that just the other week, DePaul University came out with a study that showed that Chicago is losing its 2, 3, and 4 flats. And these are the buildings that really have created the unique neighborhood-centric feel of our city. In some neighborhoods, such as along the 606, these buildings are being turned into single-family homes. But by and large, across the city, they're being turned into vacant lots. And that shows that we have disinvestment going on in our neighborhoods, where housing providers just can't make it work financially, and so they're walking away.
So I have a couple of follow-ups based on that. You mentioned the disappearing 2 and 3 and 4 flats. Is that is that because the renters in those flats aren't paying, and so the owner has to sell, and whoever purchased it tears it down? Or is it that the owner ends up tearing it down because they've gone into bankruptcy or they have to sell it off some other way?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can't speak to the hard data that DePaul University went over, but I can say anecdotally, we found that many housing providers are having difficulty just maintaining the buildings. The regulatory environment in Chicago is so challenging for housing providers, and you can get fined tens of thousands of dollars for inconsequential mistakes, like paper clipping a receipt to a lease instead of stapling it. Those types of gotchas are really adding up and making it a challenge for housing providers to provide housing. And so they're just walking away because it's unfortunately it's not financially sustainable.
The other part that you mentioned earlier was that you said some people are unable to pay and others are unwilling to pay. Do you have any kind of information or data on how many renters have been able to pay during the pandemic, but due to the eviction moratoriums and things like that, have simply said, well, you can't kick me out, so I'm not going to pay?
You know, this past year has shown great things about Chicago, and Chicagoans coming together, binding together to help each other and keep their communities and neighborhoods active. And so by and large, renters have been able to do their job of being a part of the solution. Fortunately, the unemployment insurance benefits and the stimulus funds have allowed income to continue to roll into our households. And by and large, renters are meeting their responsibilities and paying their rent. But some people are taking advantage of the program. And since the eviction moratorium forbids allowing a housing provider to evict a tenant who is unwilling to pay, it's been a real challenge. And again, if you only have 4 or 5 units and one of them falls into this category, that becomes a real crisis real fast. Governor Pritzker last week indicated that the eviction moratorium is going to start phasing out in the next few weeks, and that will allow housing providers to start to address these types of problems.
Now, when we say address these types of problems, I'm sure that a lot of it is going to come in the form of evictions for unpaid rent. Not that I think anyone enjoys using evictions. It's a lengthy process. It's complicated. It's messy. But do landlords or property owners or housing providers, do they have another alternative?
Well, it's important to realize nobody likes evictions. Evictions are a lose-lose scenario for everybody. They're emotionally draining, and purely from a business perspective, they're costly and time-consuming. So housing providers do whatever they can to avoid evictions. Unfortunately, without the eviction is the only tool that housing providers have to sometimes motivate their renters to be a part of the solution. And absent that tool, many renters just are refusing to participate in creating this problem. NBOA research has shown that half of all housing providers who are doing the hard work in our neighborhoods have a tenant who is refusing to communicate. That means the housing provider is knocking on their door, emailing, calling, texting, and the renter refuses to communicate. That could be for any number of reasons. It could be because they're in crisis and they need help. And if we know what help they need, we can figure out what help to offer. But if we don't have that line of communication, we just don't know what's going on in that unit. We don't know what's happening in that household. And so we're only left to speculate. When the eviction moratorium is rolled back, that will provide an incentive for renters to start that dialogue and start communicating. And by and large, when that communication happens, an amicable solution can almost always be found. There are a lot of mediation services that housing providers use and tenant rights groups promote, and those programs are very beneficial to getting that line of communication restarted.
Is there any worry that once the moratorium is over, that folks who couldn't pay and maybe now are starting to be able to, but they're not going to get caught up anytime soon, that they can get caught up in evictions when realistically they're the ones who couldn't have paid, not as opposed to the ones who could but didn't?
So the housing providers that I speak with, by and large, all say the same thing. If they've had a renter who's been a good renter for a long time and they just had a bad year, they would much more like to keep that renter. And so they'll work out a solution. And that solution could be any number of things, including just forgiving the rent and letting the tenant remain in the unit and get caught back up when they get back on their feet. That's what we all want to do. So I don't think there's going to be this eviction wave that people are talking about. I think what's going to happen is renters are going to start being a part of the solution again if they weren't already before.
Okay. You mentioned earlier a lot of the regulations in place, especially in Chicago. I know that Chicago has its own residential landlord-tenant ordinance, RLTO. A lot of other cities have their own as well. I don't know of any counties that do, but I could be wrong.
Well, actually, just recently, the Cook County Board passed a county version of the RLTO that basically mirrors what's happening in the city and takes that into suburban Cook. These laws are intended for those housing providers who aren't doing a good job, and in many cases they're needed, but unfortunately they're usually written with the assumption that the housing provider is to blame. And so a lot of these smaller provisions, like the staple and paperclip example I gave you, or not including a signature on a document, those can lead to tens of thousands of dollars in fines and court costs. And that just makes it very difficult for these smaller individuals who have day jobs, who aren't using professional management associations or companies, who just get tripped up on these small mistakes, and all of a sudden they realize that their entire year's worth of revenue has to go to a fine. And unfortunately what that does is it just ends up raising rents for everybody, because that money has to come from somewhere.
Now, in its defense, real quick, the RLTO and other laws and ordinances of that nature oftentimes arose because those housing providers had conducted malfeasance or had been bad actors who had intentionally not attached a receipt or intentionally not kept a signature, intentionally not, and so these all got put in there. What's the balance, if there is one, between making sure that the housing provider has to act in a good way, or at least in a not malfeasant way, versus harming the property owners who may have to pay thousands of dollars in fines for a paperclip versus a staple? Mm-hmm. Where's the balance in that?
So I guess I would say that those housing providers who want to do a good job should join the NBOA or one of our affiliate organizations so that they can learn about these new laws that are coming down the pike so they don't get caught off guard. But by and large, housing providers want to provide housing. That's why they joined this industry. They want to do a good job. They want to be parts of their communities and neighborhoods. And so I don't think I can agree with the sentiment that housing providers are purposefully making mistakes, because those always involve huge fines and court costs.
Now, I don't want to cast aspersions. I'm not saying that they're intentionally doing anything. I'm saying that in the past they had done things that, for instance, I know one of the RLTO's central pieces is returning a security deposit. And that came about because it's has to be returned within 30 days, or the renter gets, I think it's 3 times the security deposit. Because in the past, there were cases where landlords would say, yes, sure, I'll give it back to you, and then just wouldn't get around to it for years, accruing interest on it, and then eventually give it back years later. And so that's why it came into
Yeah,
effect.
and so that's a great example. And in that example, if the renter had contacted the housing provider and said, hey, I didn't get my check, usually the housing provider would offer that. I have an example where the housing provider changed their accounting system after they accepted a new renter. The new renter was unable to pay the full security deposit, so the housing provider gave them a break and only had them pay half. And in that new accounting system, that got lost. And when the renter moved out years later, the system didn't show that they were owed that deposit back. That tenant ended up suing the housing provider, and it cost about $10,000 for what was a $400 or $500 security deposit in the first place. And the housing provider who I spoke with, who was virtually in tears, had said, if she had just called me and let me know that I hadn't given her back her money, I would have gladly given it back to her. And so those are the types of gotchas that make it very difficult for housing providers to exist and provide housing in this environment.
Do you see it as more of a burden on the, I'll say, non-corporate housing providers? Is it more of a burden on specifically local folks who own the building, who might even live in the building, but it's the big corporations that have the 6,000 units unto themselves? They're doing fine because they have an entire department to handle it.
Right. If you have a professional management service, then you have a system to keep track of these details. But again, if you're one of those smaller to medium-sized housing providers who only has a handful of units, and you have a day job and your own family issues to worry about, these are the details that can get lost real quickly.
Are there any specific provisions of the RLTO or other, whether it's Chicago's or Cook County's or anyone else's, that you or NBOA think should be gotten rid of because they're just not necessary and they're just burdensome?
Well, one issue we frequently talk about is judicial discretion. The current laws require the judges to install these enormous fees and fines. And if you spend your day at the courthouse, you'll hear judges complain and say, I don't think this fine is fair, but I have no discretion. I have to levy it. And so if judges had the discretion to determine between those housing providers who really aren't doing a good job and those housing providers making inconsequential mistakes that have no real impact on the renter, that would be a huge benefit.
We've seen throughout the pandemic a lot of places, especially retail, restaurants, places like that, have been struggling. A lot have gone under, never to come back. Do you know at all what kind of a percentage we're looking at of these housing providers who are, one building, they live there, the small owners that are also not going to come back, that have been forced out?
That's a great analogy, and it's important to realize that while our neighborhoods and communities miss those small independent businesses, those bars and those restaurants that do close, they had the option of closing or suspending operations. If a housing provider had closed, then the people who live in that building would have been in crisis. So we didn't have that option of closing. We had to stay open. Our research has shown that 2/3 of neighborhood housing providers don't have the money to make repairs on their buildings. And 1/3 of them can't even pay for basic building necessities. So that's a lot of leaky roofs that can't get fixed, broken sinks that can't get fixed, broken doors that can't get replaced. And so that's a real crisis. And what would it be like for you to live in a building that operates like that?
Well, certainly not pleasant, I'll tell you that.
And that's why we need to support our housing providers as they're doing the hard work of providing housing.
I have one last question for you. What role, if any, is NBOA taking in terms of addressing homelessness? Is that part of its mission?
Well, right now there's actually legislation in Springfield to provide some support to housing providers in property taxes. Property taxes are usually our biggest expense, and there's an incentive program winding its way through Springfield. I don't have the details to talk about right here, right now, but NBOA supports those types of programs that can provide support to housing providers as they do their really good and important job of providing housing.
Wonderful. I'm sure we could talk here all day, but running out of time. So I want to say thank you so much for coming here. This has been a great discussion. And then I'm going to pass it back over to Joseph.
Thank you, both of you, for a wonderful discussion tonight. If you're interested in becoming a member of IVI IPO, please visit our website at www.iviipo.org. If you want to renew your membership, you can also visit the website as well. We look forward to another year of bringing you top-notch television. Thank you.